Patrick Reynolds, a former chemistry researcher turned janitor at Liberty Pharmaceuticals, stumbles upon a critical flaw in the company's breakthrough drug. With lives at stake, Patrick risks everything to expose the truth. Patrick Reynolds moved swiftly down the dimly lit corridors of Liberty Pharmaceuticals, mop in hand. The late shift gave him solitude, something he had grown accustomed to over the years. He preferred it this way. No one bothered him, and he could work in peace. But there was always a slight tension in his step, a weariness in his heart that had never fully gone away. His days of being a researcher in chemistry seemed like another lifetime, overshadowed by the weight of family responsibilities that had pushed him to leave his career behind. Now, he was just a janitor, but that didn't define him. His sister, Hannah, still in high school, was what mattered most. Since their parents passed away, Patrick had taken on the role of both brother and parent. It wasn't easy, and it often felt overwhelming, but he managed. It was Hannah's future that kept him going. She didn't know the sacrifice he had made for her, and Patrick preferred it that way. As he swept the floors near the executive boardroom, his thoughts wandered back to the years in the lab, the experiments, the excitement of discovery. It had been a different world, one where his mind had felt alive. He had been close to a breakthrough then, but everything came crashing down when he received the phone call about his parents' accident. In an instant, his life changed. Patrick bent down to pick up some discarded notes from the hallway floor, just outside the boardroom. The faint hum of voices could be heard inside. Eleanor Brooks, the company's formidable CEO, was discussing something urgent. The name wasn't new to Patrick. Eleanor was known for her ambition and drive, having transformed Liberty Pharmaceuticals into a powerful force in the industry. People said she was cold, detached, and ruthlessly efficient. Patrick never had the chance to meet her, but tonight, something would change. As he gathered the papers, Patrick paused. Eleanor's voice cut through the air, discussing a new drug about to be released. A revolutionary product that had the potential to save millions. It was supposed to be Liberty's breakthrough moment, the project they had been racing to complete under the pressure of investors eager to see results. But something was off in the conversation, a subtle change in the tone of the voices inside. "Is it safe?" one of the board members asked, his voice filled with unease. Eleanor's reply was measured but firm. "The trials are promising. The board needs to trust the data we've compiled." A different voice, one Patrick couldn't place, added, "There's no room for delays. We need to push this through, flaws or not." Flaws. The word echoed in Patrick's mind, sending a chill down his spine. He wasn't supposed to be eavesdropping, but something stopped him from leaving. Something in him, the part that had once been a scientist, knew that this was more than just corporate pressure. As the conversation continued, Patrick pieced together the details. The formula was unstable. Not lethal, perhaps, but dangerous. It had the potential to cause significant harm in the long run. Side effects that hadn't been fully tested, risks that were being downplayed. The company's focus was on getting the product out fast, satisfying the investors, and securing their profits. Patrick's heart raced. He knew chemistry. He knew what they were talking about. And he knew that what they were planning could be catastrophic if released to the public without further testing. As the executives wrapped up their discussion and left the boardroom, Patrick stood frozen for a moment, grappling with the gravity of what he had overheard. His mind flashed back to his own research days, to the protocols and ethical standards he once lived by. He had left that life behind, but now, it seemed to be pulling him back in. His pulse quickened. What was he supposed to do? He was just a janitor now, not a researcher. Who would believe him? And if he said something, would anyone even listen? But Patrick couldn't shake the feeling that lives were at stake. He couldn't ignore what he knew. He had to do something, anything. Swallowing the lump in his throat, Patrick gathered his courage. He knew where Eleanor's office was. He had never spoken to her before, but tonight, he had no choice. As he made his way to her office, the weight of his decision pressed heavily on his shoulders. Patrick stood outside Eleanor Brooks' office, his nerves fraying with every passing second. The sleek, glass door separating him from the CEO felt like an impenetrable barrier. What was he doing here? A janitor, about to walk into the office of one of the most powerful people in the industry and challenge her decisions. His palms were slick with sweat, and for a brief moment, he considered walking away, forgetting the whole thing. But the thought of the drug, the potential disaster, pushed him forward. Lives were at risk, and he couldn't live with himself if he stayed silent. He knocked lightly on the door, unsure if Eleanor was still inside or if she'd already left for the night. To his surprise, her voice called out, sharp and authoritative. "Come in." Patrick stepped inside, trying to maintain a calm exterior. Eleanor sat behind her imposing desk, the room bathed in soft light. She didn't look up immediately, busy scanning through documents on her tablet. The silence stretched, and Patrick's heart hammered in his chest. What could he possibly say that would make her take him seriously? Finally, Eleanor looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly as she recognized him. "You're the janitor, right? Patrick, isn't it?" "Yes, ma'am," Patrick replied, his voice quieter than he intended. "Patrick Reynolds." Eleanor put down her tablet and leaned back in her chair, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "What can I do for you, Patrick?" The air felt thick with tension, but there was no turning back now. Patrick swallowed hard. "I overheard something earlier tonight, outside the boardroom." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, her expression tightening just a fraction. "Go on." "I know I wasn't supposed to hear anything, but I couldn't help it. You were discussing the new drug, the one Liberty is about to launch." Patrick took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "I'm not just a janitor. I used to work in chemistry research. I understand these things. And from what I overheard, I think there's a serious flaw in the formula. A flaw that could cause dangerous side effects." For a moment, Eleanor didn't speak. Her eyes stayed locked on him, unreadable. Patrick braced himself for her to dismiss him, for her to tell him he was out of line. But instead, she surprised him. "Explain," she said simply, her voice firm but without a trace of mockery. Patrick exhaled slowly, trying to recall everything he'd heard and piece it together. "From what I gathered, the drug's chemical structure is unstable. The interactions you're hoping for might work in the short term, but there are variables. Variables I'm almost certain haven't been fully tested in long-term studies. If this drug is released the way it is now, there could be significant side effects. Maybe not immediately, but in time, it'll cause problems. The formula, it needs to be reworked." Eleanor's gaze didn't waver as Patrick spoke. She reached into her desk drawer, pulled out a sheet of paper, and handed it to him. "Show me what you're talking about." Patrick stared at the sheet for a moment, then took it. He didn't need to think twice. His mind went into overdrive, his old training kicking in. He grabbed a nearby pen and began sketching out the chemical structures, pointing out where he believed the issue lay, showing how the molecule's breakdown could lead to dangerous compounds being released into the body over time. Eleanor watched closely, her eyes narrowing as she followed his explanation. After several long minutes, Patrick put down the pen, his heart pounding as he looked at the CEO. He'd done everything he could to explain it. Now, it was up to her. For a moment, Eleanor remained silent. Then, without warning, she rose from her chair and walked around the desk, studying the diagram Patrick had drawn. The silence felt suffocating, and Patrick couldn't tell what she was thinking. Was she furious? Did she think he was a fool for butting in? But when Eleanor finally spoke, her voice was calm, even thoughtful. "You're saying we missed this?" she asked, her tone neutral. Patrick nodded. "Yes, I'm almost certain of it." Eleanor turned to face him, her eyes cold and calculating. "Do you have any idea how much is riding on this drug? How many millions of dollars are invested? The pressure we're under to get this to market?" Patrick stiffened, feeling the weight of her words. But he couldn't back down now. "I understand. But if you release it like this, people could die. Is that something you're willing to risk?" Eleanor's expression softened, just for a moment, and she sighed. "No, it's not." She glanced at the diagram again, her mind clearly racing. "This is serious. I'll need to take a closer look at this with the team." For the first time that night, Patrick felt a flicker of hope. Eleanor hadn't dismissed him. In fact, she seemed to be considering his findings carefully. After a long pause, she finally turned to him, her eyes more intense than before. "I'll need you to meet with the research team tomorrow morning. I want them to see what you've pointed out. If you're right about this, and I believe you might be, then we're going to have to make some changes." Patrick blinked, taken aback. "Me? Meet with the research team?" "You're the one who found the flaw," Eleanor said, her voice matter-of-fact. "They'll need your insights. Besides, you clearly know what you're talking about. You don't belong in the janitorial department. Your talents are being wasted there." Her words hit him like a freight train. He hadn't expected this. Not even close. "Wait," Patrick stammered. "You want me to work with the research team?" Eleanor's gaze was unwavering. "Yes. You have the knowledge and experience we need. I'm offering you a chance to step out of the shadows, Patrick." He hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had given up his research career to take care of Hannah, to keep his life simple, predictable. Could he really dive back into that world again? Could he balance it with his responsibilities at home? Eleanor seemed to sense his hesitation. "Think about it. We'll talk more after tomorrow's meeting." Without another word, she turned back to her desk, signaling that their conversation was over. But as Patrick left her office, his mind was spinning. He had walked in to warn her about the drugs flaws. He had expected to be brushed aside. Instead, he had been offered a lifeline, a way back into the world he thought he had lost forever. As he made his way home that night, Patrick couldn't help but feel the stirrings of something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Patrick woke up the next morning with a strange sense of unease. Yesterday had felt like a whirlwind, a night that began with him merely doing his job as a janitor and ended with him on the verge of being pulled back into a world he thought he had left behind forever. Today, he was scheduled to meet Liberty Pharmaceuticals' research team, not as a janitor but as an expert. It was surreal. Sitting at the kitchen table, Patrick absent-mindedly stirred his coffee, his thoughts drifting to his sister, Hannah. She was already up, shuffling through her school books as she prepared for another day of classes. Her cheerful morning greetings, though routine, gave Patrick a grounding sense of normalcy. "You're quiet today," Hannah noted, glancing at him from across the table. "Everything okay?" Patrick hesitated. He hadn't told her about the events of last night. She didn't know that, in a few hours, he would be sitting in a room with a team of scientists, possibly getting pulled back into a life he had abandoned. He didn't want to burden her with it. Not yet. "Yeah, just a lot on my mind," he said with a forced smile. "Busy day ahead." Hannah nodded, sensing he didn't want to talk about it. "Well, I hope it goes okay, whatever it is." Patrick wished it would be that simple. Later that morning, as Patrick entered the sleek glass conference room at Liberty Pharmaceuticals, his nerves returned in full force. Inside, the research team was already assembled, deep in discussion. They didn't notice him at first. A few of them glanced up curiously as he walked in, but none seemed to recognize him beyond his janitor's uniform. Eleanor Brooks arrived shortly after him, her presence commanding immediate attention. "Everyone, this is Patrick Reynolds," she began, gesturing towards him. "He's the one who identified a potential flaw in the drug's formula, and he's agreed to help us rework it." The room fell into an uneasy silence. Patrick could feel the skepticism in their stares. These were trained researchers, specialists in their fields. And now a janitor was being introduced as someone who could save their project? One of the researchers, Dr. Ahmed, a senior scientist in the team, spoke first. "Wait, he's the janitor, right? With all due respect, Eleanor, is this really necessary? We've been working on this formula for months." Eleanor held up a hand, silencing any further protests. "Patrick's concerns are valid. He's a trained chemist with years of research experience. I suggest we hear him out." Reluctantly, the team turned to Patrick, waiting for him to speak. He stepped forward, feeling the weight of their scrutiny. His hands trembled slightly as he set up the documents and diagrams he had worked on late into the night. But once he began explaining the flaw in the drug's chemical structure, his confidence grew. "This part of the molecule," he pointed to a specific bond in the diagram, "is unstable. The initial effects may appear promising, but over time, the breakdown products can cause harmful side effects, liver toxicity, most likely. You'll see it in long-term trials, if you run them thoroughly. I believe the issue is here." He traced the path of the chemical reaction, highlighting the problematic area. The researchers leaned in, reviewing his work. Some exchanged glances, while others murmured in quiet discussion. Dr. Ahmed looked unconvinced but didn't interrupt. After a few tense minutes, Dr. Emily Clark, another member of the team, spoke up. "He's right. I didn't notice it before, but this part of the compound does pose a risk. If we don't address this, the drug could have catastrophic consequences." Eleanor nodded. "That's what I needed to hear. Patrick, can you work with the team to develop a solution?" Patrick hesitated. "I'll help as much as I can, but I'm not part of this team." "You're part of it now," Eleanor interrupted, her tone leaving no room for argument. "You've already proven you have valuable insights. We need those." As the meeting progressed, Patrick found himself drawn deeper into the discussion. For the first time in years, he felt that familiar rush of intellectual excitement, tackling complex problems, proposing solutions, collaborating with brilliant minds. It felt like home, and by the end of the meeting, the team's attitude had shifted. While some remained skeptical, others, like Dr. Clark, were now looking to Patrick as an equal, a critical asset to their work. But even as he delved into the complexities of the drug's chemistry, a nagging doubt began to creep into Patrick's mind. Something wasn't right. During his review of the company's data, he had stumbled upon irregularities, small discrepancies in the clinical trial results that seemed too significant to ignore. Later that day, after the team had dispersed, Patrick lingered in the lab. He accessed the clinical trial data again, poring over the numbers. His heart sank as he confirmed what he had feared. The data had been manipulated. Certain adverse effects were missing from the reports, deliberately omitted to paint a more favorable picture of the drug's safety profile. Patrick felt a cold chill wash over him. This wasn't just an oversight. It was intentional. He knew he had to take this to Eleanor. He gathered the evidence, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. This wasn't just about fixing a formula anymore. This was a cover-up, and if the drug was released without anyone knowing, it could lead to a disaster, one far worse than what anyone imagined. Patrick stood in front of Eleanor's office again, but this time, the weight on his shoulders felt even heavier. He knocked, and she called him in, just as she had the night before. Eleanor glanced up from her desk, her brow furrowed. "What is it, Patrick? You look concerned." Patrick sat down, his voice steady but grim. "It's not just the formula. There's something else. I've been looking through the clinical trial data, and it's been altered. Some of the reports, especially about adverse effects, have been manipulated." Eleanor's expression shifted from confusion to alarm. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying someone inside Liberty has been falsifying the data to make the drug look safer than it is. The real results are much more dangerous." For a long moment, Eleanor didn't speak. Her face had gone pale, her eyes hardening as the reality of what Patrick was saying sunk in. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice low, almost a whisper. Patrick nodded. "I'm positive." Eleanor stood up abruptly, pacing behind her desk, her hands clenched. "I had no idea. How could this happen under my watch?" Patrick watched her carefully. He hadn't known what to expect from her. Maybe disbelief, maybe anger. But Eleanor looked devastated, like the very foundation of everything she had built was cracking beneath her feet. After what felt like an eternity, she stopped pacing and turned to him, her expression resolute. "We need to get to the bottom of this. I won't tolerate any illegal activity in my company." Patrick felt a glimmer of relief. Eleanor was on his side. But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. There were powerful people inside Liberty Pharmaceuticals, and if they had gone to these lengths to hide the truth, exposing them would not be easy. As Patrick left Eleanor's office that evening, he knew that his quiet life was over. He was no longer just a janitor. He was in the middle of something much bigger, something dangerous. And it was only a matter of time before those responsible learned that their secret was about to unravel. Patrick's hands trembled as he shut down the computer terminal in the research lab. The weight of what he had just uncovered sat heavy in his chest. He and Eleanor had spent hours going over the manipulated data, and the truth was undeniable. Some senior executives at Liberty Pharmaceuticals had been covering up critical information, adverse reactions to the drug, long-term risks, everything that could potentially halt the product's release. These executives were willing to gamble with human lives for profit. Patrick stood in the lab, staring at the screen as the black monitor reflected his tense expression. He had spent the better part of his life believing in the integrity of science, that data told the truth if you knew how to listen to it. Now, standing in a company built on deception, he felt like he was back at square one. He needed a moment to collect his thoughts. The lab was silent now, but he knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. He and Eleanor had decided to proceed carefully, aware of how dangerous this investigation was becoming. The stakes were higher than just a faulty drug. There were powerful people with careers, reputations, and millions of dollars on the line. They wouldn't back down easily. Patrick stepped out of the lab, making his way through the quiet corridors toward Eleanor's office. He still couldn't shake the feeling that this was far bigger than just bad data. He had only scratched the surface. Eleanor Brooks sat at her desk, her usually composed expression showing cracks of deep concern. The office, once a place of authority and control, now felt like a fragile fortress under siege. As Patrick entered, she stood, already knowing what he had found. "We're in trouble, aren't we?" Eleanor said, her voice low and controlled, but the tremor of unease was unmistakable. Patrick nodded grimly. "It's worse than we thought. This isn't just one or two bad trials. They've covered up major safety concerns, falsified key data, and manipulated results across multiple phases of the drug's development. If this goes public, we're talking about lawsuits, patient deaths, the collapse of Liberty Pharmaceuticals." Eleanor clenched her fists, pacing behind her desk. "Who's responsible for this?" Patrick hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I've traced some of the decisions to a few senior executives, but it's unclear how far up it goes. The falsification started months ago, maybe even years, and whoever did this knew exactly how to cover their tracks." Eleanor stopped pacing and looked Patrick in the eye. "We need evidence. Solid, irrefutable proof. If we accuse the wrong people, this whole thing could blow up in our faces." Patrick sighed. "I've already gathered some documents, but it's not enough. We need more: internal memos, emails, something that shows they knew what they were doing." Eleanor paused, her mind racing. "There are encrypted files in the company's secure archives. If there's proof, that's where we'll find it." Patrick looked at her, alarmed. "Getting into those files isn't going to be easy. If they catch us—" "They won't," Eleanor interrupted, her voice firm. "We do this carefully, discreetly. I'll handle the board and buy us time. Meanwhile, I'll give you access to the archives." "But, Patrick," she looked at him intently, "this could destroy both of us if we're not careful." Patrick knew the risks. His quiet life, his job, and everything he had worked for hung in the balance. But he had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. People's lives were at stake. He couldn't turn back now. "I'm in," Patrick said, his voice steady. That night, Patrick and Eleanor worked in secret. Eleanor pulled strings to give Patrick access to the company's secure database, where the encrypted files were stored. It was an area of the system reserved only for the top executives, meant to hide sensitive information from anyone below the highest ranks. The air in the lab was tense as Patrick sat at a terminal, fingers racing across the keyboard. The encryption was sophisticated, but Patrick's skills from his research days hadn't dulled. Slowly but surely, he began cracking the codes, sifting through layers of hidden documents. Hours passed as Patrick dug deeper into the company's records. What he found was worse than he had imagined. There were emails, direct conversations between senior executives, acknowledging the risks of the drug. There were internal reports, clearly outlining the dangerous side effects that had been purposefully excluded from the official trial data. And then there were the orders, explicit instructions from higher-ups to alter the numbers and suppress the results to meet investor deadlines. Patrick's breath caught in his throat as he opened one particular file. It was from Roger Blaine, the company's chief financial officer, to several other senior executives. The message was short but damning. "We can't afford delays. Clean up the data. Nobody will notice, and by the time they do, it'll be too late." Patrick's pulse quickened. This was the smoking gun. Roger Blaine was one of the most powerful men at Liberty, second only to Eleanor herself. His fingerprints were all over the cover-up, and judging by the email chain, he wasn't the only one involved. Several other executives had received the message and responded in agreement, complicit in the scheme. Eleanor leaned over his shoulder, reading the email. Her face tightened as she saw the names. "Blaine," she whispered, her voice filled with cold anger. "I trusted him." Patrick clenched his jaw. "It looks like he's been orchestrating this for a long time." Eleanor straightened, her expression hardening with resolve. "We can't let them get away with this. They put profits over people's lives. This ends now." But as Patrick moved to gather the files, the security system triggered. Alarms blared, flashing red lights flooding the room. "Someone's on to us," Patrick said, panic rising in his voice. "They must have flagged the encrypted files for tampering." Eleanor's face remained calm, but her eyes were sharp. "Get what you can. We don't have much time." Patrick hurriedly copied the most critical documents onto a flash drive as Eleanor typed furiously on her phone, sending urgent messages. The alarms were getting louder, and Patrick's heart pounded in his chest. If they were caught, there was no telling what the consequences would be. Minutes later, they slipped out of the lab, the flash drive secured in Patrick's pocket. They had the evidence, but the danger was far from over. "Do you think they know it was us?" Patrick asked, his voice low as they navigated the now empty hallways. Eleanor glanced over her shoulder, her jaw clenched. "Maybe, but if they do, they'll come after us with everything they've got." "We need to go public," Patrick said. "We have enough proof to blow this wide open." "Not yet," Eleanor replied, her voice cold with determination. "We'll need to be smart about this. If we release the information without the board's backing, they'll bury us. First, we get support from the right people, those who care more about the truth than profits." Patrick nodded, though the weight of the situation pressed heavily on him. They weren't just fighting against a bad drug anymore. They were fighting against some of the most powerful people in the pharmaceutical world. As they left the building, Patrick knew there was no turning back now. The next steps would be even more dangerous. The corrupt executives wouldn't go down without a fight. But Patrick and Eleanor were ready to bring the truth to light, no matter the cost. The night air was thick with tension as Patrick and Eleanor stepped out of the Liberty Pharmaceuticals building, the weight of the stolen data on Patrick's flash drive pressing down on them like a physical burden. The alarms had stopped, but their consequences were only just beginning. The stakes were higher than ever. They had the evidence they needed to expose the corruption at the heart of Liberty Pharmaceuticals, but now they were up against powerful enemies, people with resources and influence, willing to do anything to protect their empire. As they moved into the dimly lit parking lot, Eleanor's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her expression hardening. "They know," she said, her voice low. "I just got a message from one of the board members. Word is spreading fast." Patrick's pulse quickened. "How long do we have before they come after us?" Eleanor clenched her jaw, slipping her phone back into her pocket. "Not long. They'll try to silence us before we can make this public." Patrick nodded, feeling the gravity of what they were facing. They weren't just dealing with a handful of corrupt executives. They were up against an entire system built on lies, greed, and power. If they wanted to take it down, they had to act quickly and decisively. "We need to go to the board with this now," Eleanor said, her voice filled with resolve. "There are still people there who don't know the full extent of what's been happening. If we can get their support, we'll have a fighting chance." Patrick swallowed hard. "And if they don't believe us?" Eleanor turned to him, her eyes fierce. "Then we go public. We expose everything. I'm ready to burn this company to the ground if that's what it takes." Patrick could see the fire in her eyes, the determination that had made her one of the most powerful CEOs in the industry. But he also saw something else, fear. She had built her career on Liberty Pharmaceuticals. If this scandal came to light, it wouldn't just ruin the company. It would ruin her. "You're willing to risk everything?" Patrick asked, his voice quiet but intense. Eleanor didn't hesitate. "If we don't stop this, people will die. I can't let that happen. I won't let that happen." Patrick nodded, his respect for her growing. She was more than just a businesswoman driven by profit. She had a core of integrity, one that shone through even in the darkest of times. Together, they were going to take on the very heart of Liberty Pharmaceuticals, and they were going to win. The next morning, Patrick and Eleanor met in secret with the handful of board members they believed they could trust. The meeting took place in a small, off-site location, far from the prying eyes of the company's inner circle. The tension in the room was palpable as Patrick presented the evidence they had gathered. The manipulated clinical trial data, the emails from executives, the orders to falsify results. Walter Evans, a veteran board member with a reputation for fairness, was the first to speak after reviewing the documents. He leaned forward, his brow furrowed in disbelief. This is beyond anything I imagined. How did we not see this? It was hidden, Eleanor said, her voice calm but firm, deliberately covered up by senior executives who wanted to fast-track the drug for approval. They knew it was dangerous, but they pushed it anyway to meet investor demands. Walter shook his head, his face pale. This is a disaster. If this gets out, it will get out, Eleanor interrupted, her tone steely. The only question is whether we control the narrative or let it explode in our faces. The other board members exchanged uneasy glances. Margaret Lane, a younger board member who had only recently joined the company, spoke next. We need to stop the launch immediately. If what Patrick is saying is true, we can't let this drug hit the market. We need to pull everything and start a full internal investigation. Patrick nodded, his heart pounding. This was the reaction they needed. But he knew not everyone in the room would agree. As if on cue, Roger Blaine, Liberty's CFO and the mastermind behind the cover-up, burst into the room, his face flushed with anger. What the hell is going on here? His voice boomed, silencing everyone. Why wasn't I informed of this meeting? Eleanor stood up, her face hard as stone. Because you're part of the problem, Roger. Bland's eyes flickered with barely concealed rage. You have no idea what you're talking about, Eleanor. This is a waste of time. We have a drug to launch, and we're not going to stop because of the baseless accusations of His eyes landed on Patrick, sneering, Janitor. Patrick stood his ground, holding Roger's gaze. These aren't accusations. They're facts. You manipulated the data, hid the side effects, and covered up the risks. We have the emails, the reports, everything. Roger's eyes narrowed. He glanced around the room, realizing that the other board members were looking at him with suspicion, not support. For the first time, Patrick saw a crack in his facade. You don't understand the pressure we're under, Roger snapped. This drug could save lives. The risks are minimal compared to the benefits. We can't afford to delay. Eleanor's voice was cold, unyielding. It's not about profit, Roger. It's about doing the right thing. We've put lives at risk, and we need to stop this before it goes any further. For a moment, Roger stood frozen, as if calculating his next move. Then, his expression twisted into something darker. You're making a mistake, he hissed, his voice low but venomous. If you go through with this, you'll destroy the company. You'll destroy everything you've built, Eleanor. I'm prepared to, she replied without hesitation. But I'm not letting people die for the sake of a few $1 million. Patrick could see the tension in the room reaching a boiling point. Roger Blaine wasn't going to back down easily, but they had the support of at least some of the board. They had the evidence. They had the truth on their side. But Roger was right about one thing. If they exposed this, Liberty Pharmaceuticals would be thrown into chaos. The stock would plummet, investors would flee, and the company could crumble. Eleanor's reputation, everything she had worked for, would be in ruins. Are you sure you want to do this? Patrick asked her quietly as the board members murmured among themselves. Eleanor didn't take her eyes off Roger. Yes, we're not stopping. Hours later, the hammer fell. Patrick and Eleanor held a press conference, flanked by the board members who supported them. The media buzzed with anticipation as Eleanor took the stage, her face calm but resolute. Behind her, Patrick stood with the flash drive containing the damning evidence, his heart pounding in his chest. Ladies and gentlemen, Eleanor began, her voice steady and clear. Today we are here to address a serious matter within Liberty Pharmaceuticals. It has come to our attention that a number of senior executives have been involved in a cover-up regarding the safety of one of our most important products. The room fell silent, the air charged with the weight of her words. We have discovered that critical data was falsified during clinical trials, leading to the suppression of information about the drug's dangerous side effects. I take full responsibility for what has happened under my leadership, and I am committed to making sure that those responsible are held accountable." The flash of cameras and the murmuring of reporters filled the room as Eleanor continued, laying out the evidence Patrick had uncovered. She didn't hold back. The names of the corrupt executives, the manipulation of data, the reckless pursuit of profit at the expense of human lives. It all came out. Roger Blaine wasn't in the room. By the time the press conference started, he had already disappeared. But his name was at the center of the scandal, along with several others. As Eleanor spoke, Patrick felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. They had done the right thing, exposed the truth, but now the real fight would begin. The legal battles, the public fallout, the collapse of the company. It was all inevitable. But at least they had stopped the drug from being released. They had saved lives. As the press conference ended, and the reporters swarmed them with questions, Patrick glanced over at Eleanor. She met his gaze, her expression exhausted but resolute. "We did it," she said softly. Patrick nodded. "Yeah, we did." But he knew this was only the beginning. The days following the press conference were a whirlwind. The news spread like wildfire. Liberty Pharmaceuticals, once a titan in the pharmaceutical industry, was now at the heart of one of the biggest corporate scandals in recent history. The revelations sent shockwaves through the business world, and the fallout was swift. Liberty's stock plummeted, and its once loyal investors pulled out en masse. Headlines screamed about the betrayal, the cover-up, and the lives that had been endangered in the pursuit of profit. For Patrick and Eleanor, there was no time to savor any sense of victory. The real battle had only just begun. The company was in free fall, and with it came a barrage of lawsuits, investigations from regulatory agencies, and public outrage. The media turned its focus on them. Eleanor, the CEO who had allowed this corruption to take place under her watch, and Patrick, the former janitor turned whistleblower who had uncovered the truth. Patrick found himself thrust into the spotlight in ways he had never anticipated. Reporters camped outside his modest home, eager for interviews and quotes. He became a symbol of integrity and bravery, the man who had put ethics above personal gain. But the pressure was immense. His quiet life with his sister Hannah was gone, replaced by a storm of attention and scrutiny. One evening, sitting on the worn couch in his living room, Patrick stared at the flickering TV screen, the latest news coverage playing in the background. Hannah sat beside him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "They're calling you a hero," she said softly. Patrick shook his head. "I'm not a hero. I just did what I had to do." Hannah frowned. "You saved lives, Patrick. That drug could have hurt so many people. You did the right thing." He looked at her, exhaustion evident in his eyes. "I know, but this isn't over. Not even close." Meanwhile, Eleanor faced a different kind of pressure. The board was fractured. Some supported her decision to expose the corruption, while others viewed it as a betrayal. Liberty Pharmaceuticals was on the brink of collapse, and she was at the center of the storm. The company's reputation was in tatters, and the legal consequences were mounting. Every day brought a new lawsuit, a new demand from regulators, and more questions about how the company would survive. In the weeks following the press conference, Roger Blaine was arrested. His involvement in falsifying the data, along with several other senior executives, had been irrefutably proven. They were charged with multiple counts of fraud, corporate misconduct, and endangerment. The public outcry was deafening, and Roger became the face of corporate greed. But despite this, the fight wasn't over. Eleanor knew that even with the corrupt executives gone, Liberty Pharmaceuticals was still in danger. Investors were pulling out, and public trust was shattered. The company needed to make a radical shift if it was to survive. In a pivotal meeting with the board, Eleanor stood her ground. "We need to rebuild from the ground up," she said, her voice firm. "This company has been operating under a toxic culture for too long. If we want to regain public trust, we need complete transparency. We need to be the company that puts lives before profits." Walter Evans, the veteran board member who had supported her from the beginning, nodded in agreement. "I think you're right. We've lost everything, except our integrity. It's time to change." Not everyone agreed. Some board members argued that Eleanor's approach was too drastic, that the company couldn't afford to take such risks. But Eleanor was resolute. "We've already risked people's lives once. We're not doing it again." For Patrick, The attention had become overwhelming. He had gone from being invisible to having reporters knocking on his door at all hours. One evening, as he sat with Eleanor in a quiet cafe, trying to escape the chaos for a moment, he voiced his concerns. "I never wanted any of this," he admitted. "I wanted to help, but now it feels like my life is completely out of control." Eleanor gave him a sympathetic look. "It'll pass. You did something incredible, Patrick. People see that. They want to know the person behind the story." Patrick sighed. "I'm just not sure I want to be the person they're looking for." Eleanor leaned forward, her gaze steady. "You did what so many people wouldn't have the courage to do. Don't forget that. You saved lives, and you helped clean up a mess that could have destroyed countless others. That's something to be proud of." Patrick nodded, but the weariness in his eyes remained. "I just want to get back to normal. Back to Hannah. Back to my life." Eleanor smiled faintly. "You deserve that. But normal might look a little different now." As the months passed, Liberty Pharmaceuticals began to stabilize. With the corrupt executives removed and the company's leadership restructured, Eleanor focused on transparency and rebuilding trust. She implemented sweeping reforms, changing the way the company conducted clinical trials and prioritizing safety above all else. It was a long, difficult road, but slowly, Liberty began to regain some of the trust it had lost. Patrick returned to his quieter life, though it was forever changed. He had been offered a permanent position on the research team, a way back into the world of chemistry and scientific discovery, but he declined. After everything that had happened, he realized that his priorities had shifted. He wanted to focus on his family, on raising Hannah, and on finding peace after the storm. One morning, as Patrick walked Hannah to her high school, he reflected on everything that had happened. The battle they had fought, the risks they had taken, and the lives they had changed. It hadn't been easy, and the cost had been high, but he had no regrets. He had done the right thing. At the front of the school, Hannah paused and looked up at him. "You're different now," she said, her tone thoughtful. Patrick raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" She shrugged. "I don't know. You just seem stronger. Like you finally know who you are." Patrick smiled. Maybe she was right. After all the fear, the uncertainty, and the chaos, he had come out the other side, not just as a whistleblower, but as someone who had reclaimed his own integrity, his sense of self. As he watched Hannah disappear into the school, Patrick felt a calm wash over him. His quiet life might never be the same, but that was okay. He had found a new kind of peace, a peace that came from knowing that he had stood up for what was right, no matter the cost. Epilogue. Liberty Pharmaceuticals survived the scandal, though it was forever changed. The company's commitment to transparency and ethics became its new foundation, and while it would take years to fully recover, the seeds of integrity had been planted. Eleanor remained at the helm, steering the company through the turbulent waters with Patrick's quiet support from the sidelines. As for Patrick, his life returned to a new normal. He no longer worked as a janitor, nor did he return to research. Instead, he chose a simpler path, one where he could focus on what mattered most, his family. But the lessons he had learned stayed with him, a reminder that doing the right thing is never easy, but always worth it. And in the end, Patrick had found the one thing he hadn't realized he had been searching for all along, a sense of purpose.